We're going to look at the power of bureaucracy. This term discretionary authority is extremely important. It's when bureaucrats have the ability to choose the courses of action and to make policies not necessarily spelled out in advance by law, and that's by Congress. You have to understand that before the mid-1930s, the Supreme Court constantly ruled that these agencies or these bureaucrats could not do anything unless it was necessarily spelled out by Congress. But then we get to the Great Depression and we get to the New Deal programs, and so that's when we see the Supreme Court changing its stance on how much the bureaucracy or the bureaucrats themselves could do. So from the 1930s on, the Supreme Court started allowing the bureaucrats to use more of their authority. So Congress didn't necessarily have to go into great detail on how these organizations were going to run. They left it up to them. And there is also a chart in your book on page 387, actually three charts, and it shows comparing how much money is spent, the number of employees, and how many regulations. So when we compare the number of regulations to the number of people in terms of the expansion, huge increase in the number of rules and regulations compared to the increase in the bureaucracy compared to how much money they're spending. So what that indicates is that Congress has delegated a substantial amount of authority to these administrative agencies, which increases their discretionary authority. They can make decisions and policies without going back to Congress and without worrying about what Congress thinks. And some of these include paying subsidies. This is money that's given to farmers and veterans and scientists and schools and hospitals. Grants and aid, we've already talked about that, where we're going to transfer money from the federal government to the state governments. These are more closely monitored by Congress than when one of these agencies devises and enforces regulations for different sectors of the society and economy. So they have a lot more independence when they're making regulations as opposed to when the federal government gives the state money. Congress is going to take a look more closely on that. In terms of appointed officials and their increased discretionary authority, once again, this happens after the 1930s and after the Supreme Court ruling. So now you have bureaucracy or the bureaucrats or these different agencies who get to determine who owns television stations in terms of automobile safety features. They get to determine who's going to get money for scientific research. Drugs that are going onto the market, if corporations or different businesses can merge. So there's tons and tons of things now that bureaucracy is in charge of that Congress really doesn't have anything to do with. Federal civil service. I have a video posted here that I'd like for you to watch. It's about 10 minutes long, but it definitely goes into the reforms and things like that, talking about how now we're going to recruit based on merit, no political patronage. And when I say that, that didn't happen in 1978. That happened way back. We talked about the Pendleton Act, and that will be in that video also. So the video talks about the civil service system, and then it also talks about the reforms in 1978. So from previous videos, you know that we have the Pendleton Act, which is a result of the Republicans stepping in and making some changes after the assassination of Garfield. Talk about competitive service just for a minute. So when we go from patronage to this civil service, now we're going to start appointing people based on some sort of written exam that they have to pass. And you have to know the Office of Personnel Management, and they're the ones who administer all these tests, and they're the ones really are kind of like human resources, I guess, for the government. Over time, OPM has become more decentralized. These agencies don't look to them for referrals so much anymore. Exams are less common, and it really is because of the complex needs of some of these departments. You know, we can't just be pulling people off the street who can pass a simple test and say you can have these jobs. There are some really complex jobs that need to be done, and so these departments really don't want to pull from a whole pool of people who are trying to get into the government. They want people who are specialized, more professionally trained people. And then one of the other things that is really important in terms of why we go away from these written tests, um, you have groups who were starting to protest about, once again, what government looks like. We've talked about WASP before. So the racial composition. We want to make sure that we are being fair in the distribution of jobs. And so you are going to see blacks, Hispanics, definitely minorities being put into these jobs so that we have, as opposed to when we look at Congress, who are more of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. When we look at the bureaucracy, it really is a cross-section of American society. Now, having said that, most of your lower level positions, your lower grade levels, are held by minorities and African Americans. And when you start looking at your cabinet position and your higher ranking levels, these once again tend to be your white, middle-aged, college degree holding men. And then going back to the Patronage Act, transferring, or the Pendleton Act, transferring from patronage to the merit system. This was something that was pushed through by the Republicans, and it was a push due to this abuse of the spoils system, once again highlighted by Garfield's assassination. And the Republicans felt like if the Democrats came into office, because everyone was so anti-spoils mindset at that point, they were afraid that the Republican office holders would be fired. So if we go from this and now say you get to hold the jobs even if the Democrats come into office, a lot of these Republicans would still be able to hold their positions. And ironically enough, the Democrats do end up coming into office.